The wind came first, low and restless, slipping through the cracks of the town like it had something to say. Folks in Bitter Creek knew that kind of wind. It carried warning, the kind that made men pause mid-step and women look up from their stoves with a quiet, uneasy feeling. By noon, the sky had turned a dull, heavy gray, pressing down on the wooden roofs and empty streets. By evening, even the animals had gone still. No one needed to say it out loud. A storm was coming. Not just any storm, but the kind old-timers spoke about in lowered voices. The kind that buried fences, swallowed roads, and left towns forgotten under walls of snow. At the far edge of Bitter Creek, where the last house leaned against a crooked fence, and the land stretched wide and lonely, she stood watching the horizon. Her coat was pulled tight, her hands steady despite the cold biting at her fingers. Most people in town thought she kept to herself because she preferred it that way. Truth was, she had learned long ago that quiet was safer than being known. She turned before the first snowflake even fell. Inside her small house, everything had its place. Shelves lined with jars, sacks stacked neatly against the wall, tools cleaned and ready. It did not look like much to an outsider, but every item had been gathered with care over time. While others spent their days in the warmth of the saloon or trading stories near the general store, she had been working, planning, preparing, because she believed the storm would come. And now it was here. Back in town, most folks were slower to act. The general store had a short line that afternoon, people picking up a little extra flour. A bit of salt pork, maybe a lantern wick or two. There was talk, sure, but not fear. Bitter Creek had seen storms before. They always passed. The sheriff leaned against the post outside, calm as ever, telling anyone who would listen that there was no need to panic. A few nodded, comforted by his steady voice. Others weren't so sure, but they followed the lead anyway. That was the way things worked in a place like Bitter Creek. People trusted what they could see. And right now, the sky, though dark, hadn't yet shown its teeth. By nightfall, it did. The wind rose sharp and loud, rattling shutters and howling down the empty streets like something alive. Snow fell thick and fast, covering tracks as soon as they were made. Doors shut tight, lamps burned low. Families gathered close, listening to the storm build strength with every passing hour. At the edge of town, her lantern still burned. She moved quickly, but not in panic. There was purpose in every step. A crate was dragged from beneath the floorboards, its wood worn but strong. She lifted the lid and checked the contents one last time. Blankets, wrapped tight. Dried food, enough to last weeks if rationed. Small bundles tied with care, each one holding something that might mean the difference between holding on and giving up. She did not keep these things for herself. That was the part no one in Bitter Creek knew. One by one, she carried the supplies outside, fighting against the rising wind. Snow pushed against her like a wall, but she pressed forward, making her way toward the narrow paths she knew by heart. Paths that would soon disappear completely under the storm. Her first stop was the old barn near the Miller place. The family inside had 3 young children and barely enough stored for a hard winter, let alone a blizzard like this. She left a bundle near the door, tucked where it could be found without stepping too far into the cold. No knock, no sound. She moved on. At the next house, she did the same. A crate near the porch, covered with a scrap of cloth to keep it from freezing too quickly. At another, she slid supplies beneath a loose board she knew the owner often checked in times of need. She knew this town better than most who lived in it. Not because she had always been part of it, but because she had spent years watching, learning, understanding what each family needed and what they often lacked. The storm grew worse with each passing hour. Snow piled high, swallowing fences and wagons alike. The roads vanished, and the world beyond Bitter Creek might as well have ceased to exist. No help would be coming, not for days, maybe longer. Inside their homes, people began to realize the truth. This was no passing storm. This was something else. Panic started small, a whispered worry, a glance at dwindling supplies. Then it spread, quiet but steady, like the cold creeping in through poorly sealed windows. By the second day, it was no longer something that could be ignored. Doors creaked open against the wind as people stepped out, trying to judge the storm, trying to decide what to do. Some called out to neighbors, their voices barely carrying. Others stayed inside, hoping to wait it out. Then someone found the first bundle. A sack of food left just outside their door. At first they thought it was a mistake. Then another family found one, and another. Confusion turned to curiosity. Who had done this, and why? The sheriff made his rounds as best he could, his boots sinking deep into the snow, following the scattered signs left behind. Each discovery only deepened the mystery. The supplies were placed with care, never too far, never too obvious, but always exactly where they were needed. It did not feel random. It felt planned. Back at the edge of town, her house stood dark. The lantern had gone out sometime in the night, swallowed by the storm. Snow had drifted high against the walls, nearly covering the door. From the outside it looked abandoned, like no one had been there in days. But beneath the floorboards, hidden deeper than anyone would think to look, there were still more supplies. More than she had taken out. More than she had given away. And no one knew why she had kept them there. No one knew what she had seen in the storm before it arrived, or why she believed it would be worse than anything Bitter Creek had faced before. As the third night fell and the wind showed no sign of easing, the town began to understand something unsettling. The supplies they had found were not just acts of kindness, they were warnings, carefully measured, thought out, as if someone had known exactly how long this storm would last, and exactly how much it would take to survive it. The sheriff stood at the edge of the buried road, looking out toward the last house barely visible through the snow. Something about it did not sit right with him, the pattern of the supplies, the silence from that end of town. He pulled his coat tighter and took a step forward. Behind him, the wind howled louder than ever. Ahead of him, the path disappeared completely under a fresh wave of snow. And somewhere beyond that white, frozen wall, the truth about who had saved Bitter Creek and why they had prepared for something far worse than a blizzard waited to be uncovered. The sheriff did not turn back. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, his boots sinking deep into snow that had hardened into uneven drifts. The wind pushed against him from the side, sharp enough to steal his breath if he wasn't careful. Bitter Creek had gone quiet behind him, the kind of silence that made a man feel alone even when he knew others were just a few houses away. He had walked these paths for years, knew every fence line and dip in the ground, but now it all looked different, buried, hidden, dangerous in a way he could not quite name. Still, he kept going, eyes fixed on the faint outline of that last house. Something about it stayed with him. Not just the supplies. Not just the careful way they had been placed. It was the timing. Every bundle had shown up right when a family needed it most. Not too early, not too late. As if someone had been watching every home, counting every meal, measuring every day of the storm before it even began. That kind of knowing did not come from guesswork. A sudden gust forced him to stop and brace himself. Snow whipped across his face, stinging his skin. He waited it out, steadying his breath, then moved again. The house was closer now, barely visible through the shifting white. Back in town, the mood had changed. People no longer spoke of waiting out the storm with quiet patience. There was worry in their voices now, real and growing. The supplies had helped, that much was clear. Without them, some families would have already run out. But there was something unsettling about not knowing where they had come from. The Miller family sat close to their small fire, the children wrapped in blankets that had not been theirs just a day ago. The mother kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to knock, though no one ever did. The father had gone out once, trying to follow the tracks left near their barn, but the wind had erased everything within minutes. At the general store, a few men had gathered, speaking in low voices. One of them swore he had seen a figure moving through the storm on the first night. Another said it was impossible, no one could have stayed out in that kind of cold for so long. A third suggested it might have been someone passing through, though that idea faded quickly. No traveler would know the town well enough to leave supplies exactly where they were needed. The talk circled back to the same question every time: who had done this? And why keep it hidden? At the edge of Bitter Creek, the sheriff finally reached the house. The front door was nearly buried, only the top half visible above the drifted snow. He cleared enough space to push it open, the wood groaning under the pressure. Cold air rushed inside, swirling through a room that felt too still. He stepped in slowly, closing the door behind him to block the wind. The place was not abandoned. That much was clear right away. Everything inside was neat, almost careful in a way that spoke of habit rather than show. A small table sat near the window, a cup still resting on its surface. Shelves lined the walls, though many of them were now empty, the missing spaces telling their own story. He moved further in, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There were marks on the floor, faint, but there, signs that something heavy had been dragged from one place to another. He followed them, each step stirring up thoughts he could not quite settle. The tracks led to a section of the floor near the back wall. He crouched down, brushing aside a thin layer of dust and snow that had crept in under the door. His hand paused for a moment before pressing against the wood. It shifted. Not much, but enough. With a bit of effort, he pried it open, revealing a space beneath the floorboards. What he saw there made him stop cold. Crates, more than he expected. Some still sealed, others partially opened. Supplies stacked with the same care he had seen in the bundles left around town. Food, blankets, tools, even small items that might not seem important at first glance but could mean everything in the right moment. It was not just preparation. It was planning on a scale no one in Bitter Creek had considered. He leaned back slightly, trying to take it all in. Whoever had done this had not just gathered what they needed for themselves. They had gathered enough for others. Enough to carry the town through something far worse than a short storm. But if that was the case, why hide it? Why not tell anyone? A faint sound pulled him from his thoughts. It was soft, almost lost beneath the wind outside, but it was there, a creak, then something like a slow shift of weight. He turned toward the back of the house. "Anyone here?" He called out, his voice steady but low. No answer came. He stood, moving carefully toward the sound. The air felt colder in that part of the house, the kind of cold that settled deep and did not move easily. Another step, then another. The door at the back was slightly open. He pushed it wider, revealing a narrow space beyond. Storage, maybe, or something else. The sound came again. This time, he knew he had not imagined it. Back in town, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Snow continued to fall, thick and steady, adding to the weight already pressing down on rooftops and fences. A few people had started working together, clearing what little they could, checking on neighbors when the wind allowed it. The supplies had become a quiet lifeline. No one said it outright, but they all knew they were relying on something they did not understand. The questions grew heavier with each passing hour. Some began to wonder if there was more hidden somewhere. Others worried that what had been left might not be enough. The idea that someone had known this storm was coming, truly known it, began to settle in ways that made people uneasy. Because if that was true, then what else had they known? At the house, the sheriff stepped into the narrow space, his hand brushing against the rough wall for balance. The light was dim, but he could make out shapes. More supplies, yes, but also something else. Papers, notes, perhaps. He moved closer, picking one up. It was not written like a letter. It looked more like a record. Dates, small marks beside them. Numbers that seemed to count something. He frowned, trying to understand. Then it clicked. Days. The marks were tracking days. Not just any days, but days that lined up with the storm. He flipped to another page. The same pattern. Careful, steady writing that spoke of time measured with purpose. Supplies listed beside certain days, as if someone had planned when each item would be needed. A cold realization settled over him. This had not been guesswork at all. It had been calculated. Another sound came from deeper in the space, stronger this time. Not the house, shifting, not the wind, something else. The sheriff set the paper down slowly, his attention turning toward the darkness beyond the narrow path. He took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath him, and somewhere ahead, just out of sight, something moved again. The sheriff did not call out again. He stood still, listening hard, letting his eyes adjust to the dim space ahead. The wind outside pressed against the walls, but this sound had come from within. Something shifting, slow, and careful, as if it knew he was there. He reached for the lantern hanging at his side and turned the wick just enough to raise the light. A faint glow spread across the narrow passage, touching the rough boards and the stacked crates. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and bending in ways that made the space feel smaller than it was. Another step forward. The air carried a different kind of cold here, not just from the storm, but from a place kept closed for too long. He could hear his own breath now, steady but heavier than before. Then he saw it. At the far end of the passage, just beyond the reach of the light, there was a figure, still, low to the ground, like someone sitting or crouching. He did not rush forward. "Show yourself," he said, firm but not loud. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the figure shifted slightly, enough for the light to catch the edge of a coat, the outline of a shoulder. Slow movement, careful, like every motion had to be measured. She did not come closer. Neither did he. The silence between them held more weight than the storm outside. "You've been the one leaving those supplies," he said. It was not a question. A pause followed, then a quiet voice answered from the shadows. "Yes. No fear in it, no pride either. Just a simple truth spoken without decoration." The sheriff let that settle. He had expected many things, but hearing it spoken so plainly made it feel heavier somehow. "You planned all this," he went on, glancing back toward the hidden crates. "Knew what was coming." Another pause. "I knew enough." That answer did not sit easy with him. He stepped a little closer, careful with his footing. "Storm like this don't just sneak up on a person." "Not like you're saying." She shifted again, the light catching part of her face now. Pale from the cold, eyes steady in a way that spoke of long nights and little rest. "It didn't sneak," she said. "It's been building for a long time." Back in Bitter Creek, the storm had begun to pull people together in ways that only hardship could. Neighbors who barely spoke before were now checking on one another, sharing what they had, watching for signs of trouble. At the Miller place, the father had decided to make another attempt to trace where the supplies had come from. He wrapped himself tight and stepped out into the cold, following the faint direction he remembered from before. This time he made it farther. The wind had eased just enough to leave shallow impressions in the snow, not clear tracks, but enough to suggest a path. He followed them slowly, his breath fogging in the air, his boots crunching with each step. They all led in the same direction, toward the edge of town. At the general store, a different kind of tension was building. A small group had gathered again, but the tone had shifted. Gratitude was still there, but now it mixed with something sharper, suspicion. "If someone had all that stored," one man said, his voice low but edged, "why not say something sooner?" Another shook his head. "Maybe they didn't trust folks not to take more than they needed." "That ain't the point," the first replied. "If they knew it'd be this bad, we could have been better prepared. All of us." A third man leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Or maybe they knew something else." "Something they're still not saying." The room went quiet after that, because that thought had already crossed more than one mind. At the house, the sheriff studied her carefully. "You kept some back," he said. "More than what you handed out." Her eyes flickered for just a second, not enough to miss. "Yes, why?" That question hung heavier than the rest. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked past him, toward the main room, toward the direction of the town hidden behind the storm. "They'll need it," she said finally. "They already do." "They'll need it later," she corrected, her voice still calm but firmer now. The sheriff frowned. "Storm's already at its worst." She shook her head, slow and certain. "No." That single word shifted something in the room. He felt it. "You're saying this ain't it," he said. "I'm saying this is only part of it." Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the walls as if to argue with her. But the look in her eyes did not change. The sheriff had seen fear in many forms over the years. Panic, anger, desperation. This was none of those. This was certainty, and that unsettled him more than anything else. "Then tell me," he said, his tone tightening. "Tell me what you think is coming." She hesitated. Not out of doubt, but like someone deciding how much truth to hand over. Before she could answer, a loud crack echoed through the house. Both of them turned sharply. The sound had come from outside, deep and sudden, like wood giving way under pressure. The sheriff moved quickly back through the narrow passage, pushing into the main room. He went straight to the window, clearing frost with his sleeve to see through the glass. For a moment, All he saw was white. Then the shape of it came into view. Part of the old fence had collapsed under the weight of the snow, dragging a section of the roof edge with it. The storm was not just covering the town anymore. It was starting to break it. He stepped back, jaw tight. If structures were beginning to give way now, then supplies alone would not be enough. People would need shelter, reinforcement, a plan. He turned back toward her. "You knew this would happen too," he said. "I knew it could. That's not the same as knowing. It was enough to prepare." Back in town, the Miller man reached the rise that marked the edge of Bitter Creek. From there, he could just make out the faint outline of the last house through the storm. He stopped, catching his breath. Something about standing there made the whole situation feel different. The supplies, the timing, the path he had followed, it all pointed here. He took a step forward. Behind him, the wind shifted direction, carrying with it a sound that made him pause. Voices, faint, but there. He turned, squinting through the snow. Shapes were moving in the distance. More people had followed. At the general store, the tension had finally tipped. A few had decided to act instead of talk. "If there's more supplies out there," one of them said, pulling on his coat, "we can't just sit and wait for them to show up. And if someone's been holding back," another added, "we deserve to know why." They stepped out into the storm together. Not in panic, but with a shared purpose that carried a different kind of danger. At the edge of town, paths that had once been hidden were beginning to fill with people moving in the same direction, toward the last house, toward answers. Inside that house, the sheriff stood between the woman and the door, the weight of what was coming pressing in from both sides. "You hear that?" he said quietly. She did. The distant movement, the faint sounds carried by the wind. Not clear, but enough to understand. "They're coming?" he added. Her expression did not change much, but something deeper moved behind it. "They weren't supposed to come yet," she said. That caught his attention. "Yet?" She looked toward the hidden space beneath the floor, then back at him. "There isn't enough ready," she said, more to herself than to him. "For what?" he pressed. This time, when she answered, her voice carried something new, not fear, but urgency. "For when the storm turns." The word hung in the air like a warning that had come too late. The sheriff held her gaze, trying to measure what she meant, but the sound outside was growing stronger now. Voices, carried through the wind, uneven but real. More than a few people, enough to change things. "You better start talking plain," he said, his voice low but firm. "Because they're not coming here for quiet answers." She nodded once, as if she had expected this moment all along. Still, there was a tightness in her shoulders now, a weight that had not been there before. "The storm hasn't peaked yet," she said. "What you've seen so far, that's just the first push. The wind shifts after this. It traps the cold low to the ground, packs the snow harder, makes it heavier." The sheriff frowned. "Storm's already breaking fences and roofs, and it will break more," she replied. "But that's not the worst of it." A loud thud shook the front door, both of them turning at once. Snow had piled higher, pressing hard against the wood. Another hit followed, not from the storm this time. A voice came through, muffled but clear enough. "Anyone inside?" The sheriff stepped forward and forced the door open just enough to see out. A handful of townsfolk stood there, bundled against the cold, their faces tense and searching. Behind them, more shapes moved through the snow, slowly gathering. The Miller man stood near the front, his breath heavy, eyes moving from the sheriff to the house behind him. "So it's true," he said. "This is where it's all coming from." The sheriff glanced back over his shoulder before answering. "You shouldn't be out in this. We shouldn't be in the dark either," another voice called from behind. More people pushed closer, the storm swirling around them, their unease rising with every passing second. Inside, she stayed where she was, listening. The sheriff stepped out just enough to face them, keeping the door from swinging wide. "You all need to head back. This weather's turning worse." "We've already seen worse," the Miller man replied. "What we need now is the truth," a murmur of agreement followed. The sheriff studied them, knowing he could not send them away with nothing, not anymore. "There are supplies here," he said carefully. "More than what you found." That stirred them. "How much more?" someone asked. "Enough," he said. But not for wasting time standing out here. Then why weren't we told? Another voice cut in. Why hide it? The question landed harder this time, sharper, carrying the doubt that had been building all along. The sheriff hesitated just long enough for it to show. That was all it took. She knew, didn't she? The Miller man said, his eyes narrowing. Knew this storm was coming worse than the rest of us. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Inside the house, she stepped forward. The sheriff turned slightly as she came into view, the light from the doorway catching her face. The crowd shifted at the sight of her, some recognizing her, others just seeing the person tied to the mystery. She did, the sheriff said before anyone else could speak. The wind pushed harder against them, as if urging things along. Then say it, someone called out. Say why? She moved closer to the door, stopping just inside the frame. Her eyes passed over the faces gathered there, people she had watched for years without them knowing. I've seen storms like this before, she said. Not here you haven't, one man replied quickly. This town stood through plenty, she shook her head. Not like this. There was something in her voice now that quieted the interruptions. Not force, but a steady weight that made people listen. Years back, far from here, a storm came through that looked the same at first. Wind, snow, cold. Folks thought they could wait it out. Some had enough supplies. Some didn't. It didn't matter in the end. The Miller man frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying the storm changed, she answered. The snow got heavier, the air colder, doors froze shut, roofs caved in. People couldn't reach each other. A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. And the supplies, the sheriff said, picking up on it now. They weren't enough. They were scattered, she replied. Not where they needed to be when things got worse. The wind howled again, louder than before, driving snow across the gathered group. A few turned their faces away, shielding their eyes. You're guessing, someone said, though their voice lacked strength. I'm preparing, she answered. Another crack sounded in the distance, deeper this time. Not close, but not far enough to ignore. Everyone heard it. The sheriff stepped forward. You all heard that. Things are starting to give way. What's your point? The Miller man asked, though his tone had softened. My point is this, the sheriff said. Standing out here arguing won't keep your roof from coming down. A few nodded, but the tension held. Then what will? Another voice asked. Inside the house, she spoke again. Moving, she said. All eyes turned back to her. You can't stay spread out, she continued. Not when the storm turns. You need to be closer, stronger buildings. Shared supplies. Places that can hold against the weight. The idea settled over them slowly. Leave our homes, someone said. Temporarily, she replied. Or you risk losing more than that. The sheriff watched the group, seeing the struggle in their faces. Pride, fear, doubt, all of it mixed together. You're asking a lot, he said quietly. I know, she answered. Another gust slammed into the house, shaking the frame. Snow fell from the roof edge in a heavy sheet, thudding against the ground. The Miller man looked back toward town, then at the others. If what she's saying is true, we don't have much time. And if it's not, someone countered, then we've wasted a few hours staying together, he said. Better than risking everything staying apart. That shifted things. People began to look at each other instead of just the house. Quiet conversations started, quick and urgent. The sheriff stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. You're sure about this? She met his eyes. As sure as I can be. That's not the same as certain. It's enough. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly. Outside, the group had begun to settle into a rough decision. Not agreement, not fully, but movement in that direction. We'll need those supplies, the Miller man said, turning back. All of them, she shook her head. Not all. That brought the tension back in an instant. What do you mean, not all? One man snapped. Some stay here, she said. For later. Later might not come if we don't make it through now, he shot back. The sheriff stepped in before it could rise further. You take what's needed for moving folks and securing the main buildings. Leave the rest until we know how bad this turns. And if she's wrong, the man pressed. The sheriff held his gaze. Then we'll deal with that when we come to it. The wind surged again, stronger than before, pushing several of them off balance. Snow swirled thick, cutting down what little visibility they had left. Time was slipping. "Decide," the sheriff said. One by one they nodded. Not because they were certain, but because they had no better choice. They began to move, some heading back toward town to gather others staying to help carry supplies from the house. The work was quick, rough, driven by urgency more than order. Inside, the hidden space was opened wider, crates lifted and passed along in a steady line. The sheriff worked alongside them, his movements sharp and focused. She stood near the opening, watching each crate as it left, measuring what remained without writing anything down. The storm pressed harder against the house, the wind shifting just enough to change its sound. She felt it before she spoke. "It's starting," she said quietly. The sheriff paused, turning toward her. "What is?" She looked toward the door, where the snow now moved in a different pattern, tighter, faster, driven by a colder force. "The turn." Outside, the sky darkened further, though it was still day. The wind dropped for a brief moment, just long enough for everything to feel wrong. Then it came back stronger than before, carrying a cold so sharp it burned. People shouted as they struggled to hold on to what they carried. The path back to town blurred under fresh snow, the distance suddenly feeling longer than it had before. The sheriff stepped to the doorway, looking out at the chaos building in seconds. Behind him, the last of the crates sat half-buried beneath the floor. In front of him, the town fought against a storm that was no longer the same as it had been an hour ago. And somewhere in that shifting white, the line between making it through and losing everything grew thinner with every passing moment. The wind hit like a wall. It came back stronger than before, sharper, colder, pushing through coats and gloves as if they were nothing. Snow no longer drifted in soft waves. It drove straight and fast, packing into every space it could find. The path that had been made minutes earlier was already gone. "Move!" the sheriff shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. "Don't stop moving." The line of townsfolk tightened, each person carrying what they could from the hidden supplies. Crates, sacks, blankets bundled tight. It was not neat work anymore. It was survival. She stepped out last, pulling the door closed behind her with effort. For a moment she looked back at the house. Snow was already climbing the walls again, covering any sign that someone had lived there. Then she turned and followed. The trip back to Bitter Creek felt longer than it should have been. Every step had to be forced, every breath measured. The cold bit deep, but it was the weight of what was coming that pushed them forward. By the time they reached the center of town, people were already gathering. Doors opened and closed in quick bursts as families moved between houses, calling out to one another. The sheriff wasted no time. "General store and meeting hall," he called. "Bring everyone there, now." There was no arguing this time. The shift in the storm had taken away any doubt. People moved quickly, helping one another, carrying children, guiding the elderly through the thick snow. The supplies were brought in and stacked along the walls of the larger buildings, hands working fast to sort what was needed first. Inside the general store, the air was tight but warmer. A fire burned strong in the corner, and more wood was brought in as soon as the doors closed. Blankets were passed around, food unpacked and divided carefully. She stayed near the entrance at first, watching the movement, listening to the way the storm pressed against the walls. The sound had changed. It was deeper now, heavier, like the whole town was being buried under something that would not lift easily. The sheriff stepped up beside her. "You were right about the turn?" She nodded once. "It's not done yet." He glanced around the room. People were settling, but there was still tension in their faces. "They'll hold here," he said. "Stronger walls. Shared heat. They need to stay together," she replied. "No one goes back out unless it's necessary." He gave a short nod. "I'll make sure of it." Across the room, the Miller family sat close, the children wrapped tight in blankets. The father caught her eye for a moment, then gave a small nod of his own. It was not a full understanding, not yet, but it was something. Hours passed, though it was hard to tell how many. The storm raged outside without pause. At times, the building creaked under the pressure, the roof groaning as snow piled higher. Each sound drew quiet glances, but the walls held. People began to fall into a rhythm. Small tasks gave them focus. Keeping the fire fed, checking the doors, passing out food in measured portions, watching over one another. The hidden supplies made the difference. There was enough. Not plenty, but enough to ease the fear that had been creeping in before. At one point, a young boy asked where all of it had come from. His mother hushed him gently, but the question lingered in the room. The sheriff answered it simply. Someone planned ahead. That was enough for now. Through the long stretch of the storm, she moved quietly among them, helping where she could, adjusting things when needed. She did not take more than her share. She did not speak more than necessary. But people noticed. The way she seemed to know when the fire needed more wood before anyone said it. The way she checked the door at just the right time, clearing snow before it froze solid. The way she kept track of the supplies without writing anything down. By the second day of the term, the worst of it began to pass. Not suddenly, but in small changes. The wind eased just a little. The sound against the walls softened. The cold remained, but it no longer cut as sharply. Cautiously, the sheriff opened the door a crack and looked out. The town was buried. Snow lay high against the buildings, covering fences and paths completely. But the structures still stood. The general store, the meeting hall, the nearby homes that had been reinforced, they had held. He closed the door again and turned back to the room. "It's easing," he said. A quiet wave of relief moved through the people. Not loud, not cheering, just a shared breath that had been held too long. They waited a while longer before stepping out in small groups. The work of digging out began slowly, carefully. Paths were cleared between the main buildings first, making sure everyone could move safely. As the hours passed, more of Bitter Creek came back into view. Some damage showed itself. A few roofs had sagged, parts of fences were gone, but the town was still there. And so were its people. No one had been lost. That truth settled deep. The supplies had carried them through. The decision to come together had kept them safe when the storm reached its worst. By the time the sky began to clear, pale light breaking through the heavy clouds, something in the town had shifted. People spoke differently now, quieter but closer. The lines that had once kept them apart felt thinner. Near the edge of town, the sheriff stood with her, looking out over the wide stretch of snow. "Guess we owe you more than a few questions," he said. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "You don't owe me anything. That's not how folks here see it." She let out a small breath. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You never said how you knew," he added after a while. She was quiet before answering. "I saw it once before," she said. "A town that thought it could handle a storm like this. They weren't ready for what came after the first wave. And you left." "I survived," she corrected softly. He nodded, understanding more than she had said. "And when you came here," he went on, "you started preparing." "Yes, even when no one else saw the need." She looked back toward Bitter Creek, where people were still working together, clearing paths, helping one another. "People don't always see a storm until it's already on them," she said. "But that doesn't mean it isn't coming." The sheriff followed her gaze. "They'll see things different now," he said. "I think they already do." A group approached from the town, the miller man among them. He stopped a few steps away, his expression thoughtful. "We found more of the supplies under your place," he said. "The ones left behind," she nodded. "We'll bring them in," he added. "Store them proper this time. For whatever comes next." There was no suspicion in his voice now, only a quiet respect. "That's a good plan," she said. He hesitated, then spoke again. "You should come back with us. Stay in town." She glanced at the distant house, barely visible under the snow, then back at the people waiting. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. Then she gave a small nod. All right. It was not a big moment. No grand words, no celebration. Just a simple choice. They walked back together, the snow crunching under their boots, the sky slowly clearing above them. Bitter Creek would take time to rebuild what had been damaged. Fences would be raised again, roofs repaired, paths made clear. But something stronger had taken root. The memory of a storm that nearly took everything. And the quiet, steady effort of someone who had seen it coming and chose to prepare, not just for herself, but for everyone. In the days that followed, the hidden supplies became shared stores. Plans were made for the future, not just for fair weather, but for hard times too. People listened a little closer, watched a little more carefully. And when the wind rose again in the distance, carrying that same low, restless sound, Bitter Creek did not wait as long to act. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.